There is a specific kind of silence that only lives inside a house built on a foundation of lies. A silence that isn't quiet, but heavy, a suffocating atmosphere where the truth constantly scrapes against the ceiling, threatening to fall. If you know that silence, if you've been forced to live underneath that weight, then you know this story already, or at least you know the shape of the cage I lived in. Stop scrolling for a moment, because this is about the moment the walls finally collapsed, not just revealing the light outside, but revealing the decades of darkness they deliberately built inside. This isn't just about being blamed. This is about being crafted into the family villain, the necessary scapegoat, whose purpose was not to thrive, but simply to absorb the collective failures of everyone else. I was Ethan, and I was the mistake. My sister Maya, she was the golden child. The adjective attached to her name was always promising, delicate, or successful. The adjective attached to mine was usually reckless, unreliable, or simply why. It started so small that I genuinely believed I was flawed. It wasn't an aggressive blaming, not at first. It was softer, more insidious. It was the way my mother would sigh, not at me, but about me, when the milk spilled, even though Maya had placed the carton precariously close to the edge. It was the ceramic bird, the little blue porcelain thing Dad brought back from a trip, the one that shattered on the kitchen floor when I was 9. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the crash, a sound that rips through the flimsy peace of a normal afternoon. When I came back down, Maya was standing over the shards, tears already welling up. But before a single word could be spoken, my father looked past her, straight at me, standing frozen on the bottom step, and his voice was low and disappointed. He didn't ask what happened. He just said, "Ethan, you know you need to watch where you put your things." And Maya, she just looked at the floor and let the silence confirm the accusation. She didn't correct him. That was the first lesson I learned. In this family, the absence of denial equals the confirmation of guilt, and my identity was secondary to the maintenance of Maya's pristine image. That day, the shattered porcelain bird wasn't just a material loss. It was the precise moment my internal compass broke. I started to believe I had a destructive aura, that I carried chaos on my fingertips. If I wasn't careful enough to break the bird, I must have been careless in some other way, perhaps by merely existing too loudly in the vicinity of perfection. And that belief, that internal conviction of being inherently flawed, is the most powerful tool a scapegoating family can use, because once you believe the lie, you do half the work for them. You stop fighting. You start apologizing for things you didn't do, just to shorten the heavy silence, just to minimize the look of pure exhaustion on your mother's face, the look that communicated that my failures were physically draining her life force. Years piled on top of each other, each year adding layers to the armor of blame I wore. The stakes rose exponentially as we grew older. When I was 16, I missed the application deadline for a prestigious summer internship, the kind of program that opens doors to elite universities. My parents were furious. My father sat me down and delivered a lecture, nearly 3 hours long, about personal responsibility, about how this single instance of laziness proved my lack of future discipline. He kept repeating, "You had the paperwork, Ethan. You said you handled it. Why can't you manage one simple deadline?" The truth, I swallowed back, until it tasted like stomach acid, was that Maya had needed the printer that night to finish a presentation for her debate team, and she had accidentally shredded the folder containing the application materials, thinking it was junk mail from the bank. I had found the small serrated pieces in the trash the next morning. When I confronted her, she looked genuinely terrified, not of being caught, but of losing the opportunity, losing the status of being the responsible one. She pleaded with me, her eyes wet and huge. "Dad will never look at me the same way, Ethan. I'm already stressed. It was an accident. Just tell them you forgot to mail it. It's only a summer thing." Only a summer thing. That simple phrase cost me my early admission potential. I took the fall. I let the reprimands wash over me, listening to my father compare me unfavorably to my high-achieving sister, internalizing the idea that I simply lacked the necessary drive. Why did I do it? Because even then, the small, desperate part of me still craved belonging. And in my family structure, belonging meant protecting the structure itself, even if that structure was crushing me. I thought, mistakenly, that if I took the heat, I could somehow earn a flicker of appreciation for my loyalty, or perhaps just a respite from the constant low-level tension. I didn't get respite. I got deeper disappointment, a shadow that followed me into my first year of college. The greatest instance of blame, the one that truly sealed my reputation as the prodigal failure, involved the car, my father's prized 1970s Mustang. He loved that car more than I think he loved any living being, a relic of his youth, painstakingly maintained. I was 22, home from college for the summer, working construction to save money. One Friday night, I had borrowed the Mustang, a monumental act of trust, which I knew. Maya needed to attend a party across town. She didn't drive standard, and the weather was terrible, thick coastal fog. I dropped her off and drove back alone, meticulously slow. It happened on the final turn onto our street. A flash of headlights, a sickening screech, and the jarring, deafening crunch of metal. I was T-boned by a driver who ran a stop sign. The Mustang was totaled. My arm was broken, and I was in shock, but alive. When I woke up in the hospital, the first face I saw wasn't my mother's tear-stained expression of relief that her son was alive, but my father's face, etched with a cold, terrifying rage. The insurance investigation was ongoing, but he had already declared his verdict. He was convinced I had been drag racing, or perhaps drunk, even though the police report was crystal clear. I was sober, and the other driver was at fault. But Dad didn't care about the police report. He cared about the narrative. "You were too fast, Ethan," he said, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. "You always push limits. You took my trust, and you wrecked it, just like you wrecked the car." For the next 6 months, the cost of that wreckage, the sentimental loss, the rising insurance rates, the inconvenience, became my identity. The family dynamic shifted from blaming me for small things to viewing me as a genuine financial and emotional liability. Maya was endlessly supportive of them, providing emotional labor, holding Mom's hand, offering Dad comfort over the loss of his baby. I was excluded, kept at arm's length. I learned that my physical recovery was irrelevant compared to the emotional recovery of the car, which symbolized my father's broken faith in me. What I didn't find out until years later, until the truth finally unspooled itself like a rotten rope, was the dark footnote to that accident. Maya had needed me to drive her because she had totaled her car 2 weeks earlier, drunk driving after a difficult breakup. She had lied, claimed the car was in the shop for extensive repairs, and Mom and Dad had secretly paid for the damage out of their retirement savings, terrified of the legal and reputational fallout for their perfect daughter. The night of the Mustang crash, they were already stressed, already fragile from managing Maya's secret, and my misfortune simply gave them a known, disposable target to direct their accumulated panic and financial anxiety toward. I was their pressure valve. They didn't even look at the police report confirming my innocence. They simply looked at the timing and decided which child's reputation they were willing to sacrifice to keep the boat afloat. I absorbed all of it. I finished college, moved 3 states away, kept communication minimal, and built a life defined by cautious overachieving, a desperate attempt to prove the family narrative wrong, even if they were no longer watching. I spent 10 years in quiet exile, attending holidays with the practiced diplomacy of a foreign dignitary, smiling politely, offering help, and carefully avoiding any situation where my actions could be misinterpreted as failure. The deep, heavy silence became my constant companion. The realization, the moment the truth actually arrived, didn't come in a sudden dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, painfully, during a terrible family crisis. My father had been diagnosed with an aggressive, swift illness. We were all back in the family home, existing in that strange, suspended reality that terminal illness creates. Maya and I were sharing the burden of care, though even in those desperate final months, the old dynamic lingered. If the medication was administered late, it was because Ethan was distracted. If the grocery list was wrong, Ethan must have forgotten to write down the specifics. One evening, about 2 weeks before Dad passed, I was walking down the hallway. It was late, maybe 1 a.m. I was supposed to be asleep, but the house felt stifling. I heard voices coming from the den, my mother and Maya. They were speaking in low, frayed tones, exhausted by the grief and the relentless demands of caregiving. I stopped, not meaning to eavesdrop, but simply immobilized by their closeness, the intimacy of their shared burden that I felt perpetually excluded from. They were talking about money, specifically the mortgage. "We shouldn't have done it, Maya," my mother whispered, her voice cracking, sounding older and more defeated than I had ever heard her. "We should have told him about the accident years ago. We're bleeding ourselves dry now." Maya responded with a sharp, protective hiss. "Mom, stop. Dad wouldn't have survived the truth. He needed me to be okay." He needed to believe someone in this family could be counted on. We protected him. My mother sighed, a long, ragged sound of decades of weariness. But Ethan, we gave him everything to carry. That Mustang crash, the scholarship loss, he took every single punch for you, Maya. Every single one. And he never even complained. We let him leave believing he was the reason we struggled financially for years. We let him think he was the cause of his father's distance. We let him carry your secrets. Then, a detail so specific, so unnecessary, yet so devastating that it felt like a physical blow. Remember when he was 9, the porcelain bird? I let Dad blame him instantly, because I knew if Dad looked closer, he would have seen that Maya was the one throwing the ball inside, and I couldn't bear to see that look of disappointment in her direction, not even then, not even over something so small. So we taught him early what his role was. My knees buckled. I leaned heavily against the cold plaster wall, every muscle in my body seizing up. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was an absolute vacuum. I was floating, suspended in zero gravity, watching the entire architecture of my life, my guilt, my self-doubt, my need to prove my worth, disintegrate into dust. It wasn't just the fact that Maya had been the one to break the bird, or that she had shredded the scholarship application, or that she had totaled her car drunk driving. It was the crushing, brutal clarity of my parents' complicity, their active, ongoing decision to assign me the role of villain. They hadn't merely tolerated Maya's deceit. They had orchestrated the cover-up, systematically dismantling my self-worth to preserve their illusion of a perfect daughter. They taught me early what my role was, the family dumpster. I didn't move. I stayed pressed against the wall, listening to the muffled breathing from the den, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. I felt cold, so utterly cold, the kind of deep chill that settles in your bones and tells you that you are fundamentally alone. I didn't confront them immediately. How do you confront 30 years of systemic emotional abuse? What words do you use to ask, why did you hate me enough to make me believe I was incapable of love or success? The truth had been revealed. Yes, but it didn't feel freeing. It felt like being handed the autopsy report of my own youth. The moment of realization changed my interaction with them instantly, though I said nothing. When my mother asked me later that day why I was staring into the middle distance, asking if I was upset about Dad's decline, I looked at her, truly looked at her, past the exhaustion and the grief, and saw only the architect of my isolation. The sympathy was gone. The obligation was gone. I just saw the person who made a choice every single day for 30 years that ensured my misery. And in that moment, I understood that the deepest wound wasn't the blame itself, but the calculation behind it. My father passed peacefully a few days later. In the aftermath, as Maya and I managed the funeral arrangements and the estate, the unspoken truth hung between us, thick and toxic. Maya knew I knew. Her attempts at kindness were clumsy and transparent, an overabundance of concern, a sudden eagerness to share memories. It was an attempt to renegotiate the terms of our relationship now that the old structure had been revealed, an attempt to use a blanket of shared grief to smother the fire of my righteous anger. The confrontation finally came 3 weeks after the funeral, over coffee, surrounded by boxes of Dad's possessions. Maya was stressing about selling the house. She worried about the market, about Mom's well-being, about everything but the elephant in the room. "You know, Ethan," she started, picking at a napkin, "we were just kids back then. Things were hard on Mom and Dad." "You can't hold on to ancient history. They were just trying to protect us." That was the line that finally broke my silence. The soft, justifying lie that minimized the damage she had never paid for. "They weren't protecting me, Maya," I said, my voice low and steady, not raised in anger, but weighted with finality. "They were protecting you." And the cost of that protection was my entire sense of self-worth. It cost me jobs, it cost me relationships, it nearly cost me my relationship with Dad, who died believing I was a reckless disappointment. I detailed the incidents, starting with the porcelain bird, moving through the scholarship, and finally the 2 totaled cars, laying out the timeline I now understood perfectly. She didn't deny any of it. Her head was bowed, her perfect facade finally cracked. "I was selfish," she whispered, tears falling onto the table. "I was young and scared. I should have told the truth about the car. I was just so afraid of disappointing them." "And I wasn't?" I asked. The question hung in the air, a lifetime of injustice distilled into 5 short words. "Do you think I wasn't afraid of disappointing them?" The difference, Maya, is that you knew your disappointment would be corrected, minimized, and ultimately transferred to me. I knew my disappointment would be accepted as proof of my natural ineptitude. You were scared of disappointing them. I was scared of confirming them. The revelation of the truth didn't bring closure. It brought a horrifying clarity. It didn't lead to a heartwarming apology where everything was magically fixed. It led to distance. I understood that my parents, and Maya by extension, lived in a world where the convenience of their narrative outweighed the psychological health of their son. They needed a shadow, and they cast mine. I realized that the freedom wasn't found in their apology, which would always be inadequate, muffled by excuses of good intentions and stress. The freedom was found in understanding that the responsibility for my failure, the failure they had preached for 30 years, never belonged to me. It belonged entirely to them, to their fear, to their desperate need for external validation through a perfect daughter. I packed up the few remnants of my childhood that mattered, left the boxes for Maya, and walked out. The truth didn't heal the scars, but it labeled them accurately. They are not scars of my failure. They are the scars of their fear. If you are listening to this, and you recognize the constant grating sound of that heavy silence, if you are the one who is always asked why instead of how are you, if your accomplishments are met with a cautious nod, while your siblings are met with celebration, if you feel the weight of an entire family's unacknowledged mistakes settling squarely on your shoulders, then I want you to know this, and I want you to hear it clearly. That weight does not belong to you. Your purpose is not to be a container for other people's inadequacy. The truth won't be easy. It might mean losing the structure you grew up in, however toxic it was. But the truth is the only way to finally give yourself the permission to breathe, to step out of the shadow, and to realize that the fundamental flaw was never you. It was the lens through which they chose to see you. I am now building a life free from that legacy of false guilt. It is slow, painstaking work, but every day that I don't apologize for an action I didn't commit, every success I celebrate without waiting for a parental critique, is a victory. It is the sound of the cage door slamming shut on an empty prison, one they built for me, but that I finally chose to leave. If you have been the scapegoat, if you know the exhaustion of constantly fighting a lie that everyone else agrees upon, I want to hear the specific, small incident that you took the blame for, the one that still stings today. Tell me about the broken vase, the missed opportunity, the small daily injustice that confirmed their twisted narrative. Share it below. Let us collectively unpack the lies they forced us to carry, because sharing the weight is the first step toward putting it down permanently. Thank you for listening to my truth.